The road to Hollow Creek was barely more than a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a suffocating forest. The kind of place where the fog never really lifts. It just clings to your windshield like it knows something you don't. I had been here once before, 30 years ago, when 4 children vanished without a trace. Their names still haunted the case files, their faces frozen in time on yellowing posters nailed to rotting fence posts. No bodies, no answers, just the kind of silence that crawls under your skin. Now it was happening again. Another boy, Samuel Brooks, age 10, gone in the same stretch of woods where the others disappeared decades ago. The locals whispered that the town was cursed, that the forest had taken what it wanted and would take more. But curses don't leave footprints, people do. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt heavier than I remembered. The town hadn't changed. Same boarded-up diner, same peeling paint on the sheriff's office door, same stares from faces that seemed older, but not wiser. Everyone here knew more than they were willing to say. And that silence, it wasn't fear anymore. It was complicity. Something told me this time, Hollow Creek wasn't just hiding a missing boy. It was hiding 30 years of darkness, waiting to be unearthed. The sheriff's office smelled like cold coffee and old regrets. A single flickering bulb painted everything in a sickly yellow glow, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of happier times that didn't belong here anymore. Sheriff Dalton sat behind his desk, fingers drumming nervously on a stack of unsent reports. He was here when the first disappearances happened. 30 years later, his face carried every unanswered question like fresh scars. He claimed the forest took Samuel, same as it took the others. A convenient story for a town desperate to keep its secrets buried. But there was something in his eyes, a tremor in his voice when he spoke of 1995, a weight he had been carrying that wasn't guilt, but fear. I opened the old case files. Each detail was a dead end, each lead a trail gone cold before it had even begun. And yet, they were all too similar to ignore. 4 children, gone without a trace, now a 5th. No ransom notes, no signs of struggle, just one eerie constant. All of them last seen near the Hollow Creek woods between sundown and midnight. Dalton warned me not to dig too deep, said the town doesn't like old wounds reopened. But there's no such thing as a wound that heals without truth, and something told me this town never wanted the truth to surface. As I stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting long, crooked shadows across the streets. The forest stood at the edge of town like a patient predator waiting for its next victim. I had seen fear before, but this was different. Hollow Creek wasn't afraid of a killer, it was afraid of what the killer's unmasking would reveal. The Brooks house sat on the edge of town like a forgotten promise. White paint peeled from its walls, and the porch swings swayed in the cold wind, though no one was sitting there. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if grief had settled into every corner, refusing to leave. Samuel's mother, Claire Brooks, greeted me with a look that was more exhaustion than sorrow. Her hands trembled as she clutched a coffee mug, though it was long empty. She spoke of Samuel softly, as if speaking his name too loud might break whatever fragile hope she had left. A quiet boy, loved reading ghost stories, never wandered far from home. She insisted someone had taken him. I believed her. His father, Mark Brooks, barely made eye contact. His posture was stiff, his answers clipped. The tension between them was a living thing in the room, slithering around every word they spoke. Marital strain born of tragedy, or perhaps secrets. Samuel's room was eerily untouched. A comic book lay open on his bed, a single sock on the floor, a window unlocked, despite the parents swearing they kept it bolted every night. Outside that window, the woods stretched out like an open mouth, ready to swallow anything in its path. Claire begged me to find her son, her voice cracking under years of unspoken fear. But Mark stood behind her, silent, his jaw tight, eyes darting to the forest line beyond the glass. It wasn't just grief in that gaze. It was dread, old and festering, like he knew exactly what lived in those trees and why it had returned. Hollow Creek didn't just lose a boy. It was paying for a debt long overdue, and every instinct in me screamed that the Brooks family was tangled deep in its origins. The forest waited for me, like a trap. At night, Hollow Creek's woods didn't just feel empty, they felt alive, breathing in rhythm with the wind that crawled through the trees. My boots sank into damp soil as a low mist coiled around the underbrush, curling around my legs like a warning I refused to heed. Sheriff Dalton reluctantly joined me for the search. He carried a flashlight, but his hand shook every time the beam landed on a tree, scarred with old, deep claw marks that didn't belong to any known animal. Every few yards we found remnants of the first disappearances. A rusted bicycle frame, half buried in mud, a child's shoe laced with moss, a torn flannel sleeve dangling from a branch as if the forest had been collecting trophies. We called Samuel's name, but only the forest answered, whispering through brittle leaves. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, too light to be Dalton's. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across crooked trees, but there was nothing. Only the shifting fog and the unsettling feeling that we weren't just searching, we were being watched. Then we found it. A crude wooden totem staked into the ground, decorated with faded ribbons and a small, cracked porcelain doll's head. Fresh blood stained the soil beneath it, still damp under my glove. Dalton muttered something about old stories and things better left alone, his voice breaking like a man who had spent decades pretending not to know the truth. I bagged the evidence, but it felt pointless. Whatever haunted this forest wasn't just a person. It was an inheritance of fear, passed from one generation to the next. And tonight, Hollow Creek's woods weren't done claiming what they believed was theirs. The morning after our descent into the woods, Hollow Creek was no longer quiet. The discovery of the blood-stained totem spread through town like wildfire, igniting whispers that sounded more like prayers and curses than conversation. The townsfolk gathered in the square, voices trembling, faces pale, as if the forest darkness had followed me back into their streets. Sheriff Dalton tried to keep order, but his words carried no conviction. He stood on the courthouse steps, declaring that the evidence might not be related, but no one believed him, not even himself. Old rumors clawed their way back to the surface, a forgotten pact made decades ago, sacrifices to keep the woods calm, a punishment waiting to be collected. The fear wasn't new, it was ancestral, stitched into Hollow Creek's bones. I watched Claire Brooks clutch a worn locket, her gaze distant, while Mark lingered on the edge of the crowd, fists clenched, jaw locked as though expecting a reckoning. Some townspeople looked at the Brooks family with pity, others with barely concealed blame. In this place, tragedy didn't bring people together. It sharpened suspicion like a knife. Later, I examined the totem under proper light. It was old wood, carved with symbols not quite familiar, yet disturbingly deliberate. The blood was fresh, not more than 24 hours old. It wasn't Samuel's disappearance that unsettled me most. It was that someone had marked the spot. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. And while the townsfolk spoke of curses, I knew curses didn't carve wood or spill blood or stalk forests under moonlight. People did. Somewhere in Hollow Creek, someone had been keeping the darkness alive all these years, and they were still out there, watching us unravel. The Whitaker house stood at the far edge of Hollow Creek, a crooked silhouette against a dying sky. Time had not been kind to this place. Shutters hung loose, windows clouded by grime, the yard a graveyard of forgotten toys, untouched for 3 decades. It was here that Emily Whitaker once lived, the first child to vanish in 1995. Her parents never left, as though bound to this place by grief too heavy to carry anywhere else. Margaret Whitaker opened the door, her face a ruin of sleepless nights and faded hope. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me with hollow eyes that had seen too many false promises from men like me. Her husband, Thomas, lingered in the shadows, his gaze sharp, defensive, as if my presence alone threatened to rip old wounds open. I asked about the disappearances, about the forest, about anything they remembered. Margaret's voice was brittle, every word cracking like dry leaves. She swore she heard singing the night Emily disappeared, a child's lullaby floating from the woods, luring Emily outside. No one believed her then, no one listened now. Thomas finally stepped forward, slamming his fist against the table. "It's not the forest," he spat, eyes blazing. "It's them. This town made a choice 30 years ago, and our children paid for it." He refused to say who them was. His trembling hands told me he knew far more than he dared admit. Before I left, Margaret pressed an old photograph into my hand. Emily with 3 other missing children, all smiling beneath the Hollow Creek welcome sign. A note on the back read, "Last day before the woods called." As I walked away, a single light flickered in the upstairs window of the Whitaker house, as if someone unseen was watching me go. For the first time, I felt certain these disappearances weren't random. Hollow Creek had a secret pact sealed in blood, and the forest wasn't the only predator feeding on it. The library smelled of mildew and forgotten history, its silence broken only by the creak of warped floorboards under my boots. Dust clung to every shelf, every book, as though time had stopped here decades ago, just like the case. A locked cabinet in the far corner held the town's oldest records, yellowed pages chronicling Hollow Creek's long, uneasy relationship with the forest. The document spoke of missing livestock in the 1960s, townsfolk whispering about keeping the woods satisfied. Then came 1972, a vague mention of a tragedy hushed up by local authorities. But it was a faded ledger from 1995 that made my blood run cold. 4 names: Emily Whitaker, Jason Lorne, Abigail Myers, and Thomas Reeve, listed under the words "debt paid." Each name marked with a symbol eerily similar to the carvings on the wooden totem I'd found days earlier. The librarian, an elderly woman with shaking hands, refused to meet my eyes when I questioned her. She only muttered one phrase before slipping away into the stacks. Deals made in fear never truly end. Flipping through the remaining papers, I found a town council meeting note from 3 decades ago. It hinted at an agreement between Hollow Creek's founders and an unnamed figure, someone or something tied to the forest. The language was deliberate, cold, a promise renewed to ensure safety, a life given, many spared. It wasn't superstition, it was sacrifice. When I left the archives, the sun was sinking behind the tree line, bathing Hollow Creek in blood-red light. For the first time, the pattern became painfully clear. Every 30 years, the town owed a life. This time, the forest had taken Samuel. But the weight of these pages told me the truth no one wanted to say aloud. The forest didn't take, the town offered. The diner was nearly empty. Just a few locals hunched over cold coffee and plates they weren't eating from. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but fear stretched thin. I slid into a booth across from Henry Lorne, the uncle of Jason, one of the 4 children taken in '95. His eyes were sunken, his jaw tight, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped his mug. I laid the ledger copy on the table, the words "debt paid" visible under the dull light. Henry's gaze flicked to it, then to the window, as if expecting someone to be watching. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "You don't want to know what this town gave up back then." I pressed harder, asking about the agreement. His face twisted with something between rage and despair. "We made a choice," he said, voice low and shaking. "One life to save dozens. We thought it was over after that night." His words broke off abruptly as a shadow fell over the booth. 2 men stood there, broad-shouldered, eyes cold. Locals, but not strangers to violence. One leaned down, his breath sour, his tone a warning wrapped in menace. "Some questions shouldn't be asked here, detective. Best pack your things and leave Hollow Creek before the woods decide you belong to them, too." Henry wouldn't look at me after they left. His hands trembled, his lips pressed into a hard line of guilt and fear. The diner's neon light flickered overhead like a heartbeat skipping too many beats. As I stepped outside, the town felt heavier, darker than ever before. It wasn't just secrets holding Hollow Creek hostage. It was loyalty to a blood-stained bargain no one dared break, even if it meant letting children vanish into the trees every generation. The motel room was silent except for the hum of the old radiator. I had been reviewing the case notes, piecing together scraps of lies and half-truths, when a faint creak echoed outside my door. By the time I moved, it was too late. The footsteps were already gone, swallowed by the night. I opened the door to find nothing but the cold air pressing in, and then I saw it, smeared across the hood of my car in thick, dripping red paint. "Stop digging, or you'll join them." The words ran like fresh blood, pooling on the cracked asphalt. Whoever left it wanted fear to be the message, but to me it was proof. Someone in this town was terrified of what I might uncover, or of who I might expose. Inside my room, the warning went deeper. My files, once neatly stacked, were scattered across the table. The photograph of the 4 missing children had been placed face down, and on the back, a new line was scratched in jagged handwriting. "The forest doesn't choose. We do." A sound outside drew me to the window. At the tree line beyond the parking lot, a single figure stood still, barely visible in the fog, watching, waiting. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the rustle of dead leaves and my own pulse hammering in my ears. The town's fear had turned to hostility. Hollow Creek wasn't just hiding a killer, it was protecting one. And now, I wasn't just the man investigating a case. I was the next name someone wanted to add to their ledger. The abandoned church crouched on the hill like a forgotten sin. Its steeple cracked, stained glass windows shattered long ago. The only light came from a flickering candle on the altar, where a woman sat hunched over, trembling as I approached. Her name was Lila Henderson, once a schoolteacher, now a recluse living on the fringes of Hollow Creek. A ghost among the living. She wouldn't look at me at first, only clutching a small wooden cross in her hands, knuckles white. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, almost broken. "It wasn't the woods that took those children," she whispered. "It was someone we trusted, someone the town swore to protect." I pressed for a name. She shook her head violently, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. "They made a deal 30 years ago. They chose which children would go missing, and the one who carried it out." She froze as if even saying the rest would cost her life. Then, with a trembling finger, she traced the outline of a sheriff's badge in the dust on the pew. My blood ran cold. Before I could ask more, the sound of footsteps scraped across the church floorboards, heavy, deliberate. We weren't alone. A shadow moved in the doorway, watching us. Lila's eyes widened in terror. She hissed a single warning. "They're still hunting." By the time I reached the door, whoever it was had vanished into the night, but Lila's trembling hand had already drawn the first line, connecting the past to the present. And if what she implied was true, the predator wasn't hiding in the forest. It was wearing a badge, walking freely among us. The records office was a mausoleum of dust and forgotten truths. I picked the lock under cover of night, the metal tumblers clicking softly against the hush of a sleeping town. My flashlight cut through darkness, illuminating stacks of files left to rot. Somewhere in this paper graveyard lay Sheriff Dalton's past, buried like everything else Hollow Creek wanted erased. I found his personnel file first. A commendable career on paper, but certain details didn't fit. In 1995, the year the 4 children vanished, Dalton disappeared from official reports for 12 days during the height of the search. No explanation, no record of his whereabouts. Later that year, he received a sudden promotion and a Civic Heroism Award, though there were no documented acts of bravery tied to his name. Then I stumbled on a sealed folder, stamped Confidential, Town Council Only. Inside were minutes from closed-door meetings, phrases underlined in red, agreement honored, sheriff liaison, and one that chilled me. Selection process undisputed. Dalton wasn't just a lawman searching for lost children. He had been part of the choosing. A noise shattered the silence. Papers fluttered as the window creaked open. My flashlight swung just in time to catch a gloved hand slipping inside. A shadow darted across the room, and a voice hissed from the dark. "You don't know what you're digging up, stranger. Stop, or we'll finish what the forest started." I lunged toward the intruder, but they vanished through the broken window, leaving only the stench of cigarette smoke and a single muddy footprint on the sill. Dalton's secrets weren't just buried, they were being guarded, and now whoever protected them knew exactly where I was. The sheriff's office was dimly lit, one lonely desk lamp throwing long shadows across the room. Dalton sat behind his desk, cigarette smoke curling around his weathered face. When I entered, his hand hovered near the drawer where his revolver rested, not to draw it, but to remind me he could. I laid the confidential folder on his desk. The red underlined words glared up at us both. Selection process undisputed, agreement honored, sheriff liaison. Dalton didn't even look surprised. His eyes just hardened, like a man who had been waiting 30 years for this conversation. "You think you know this town," he said, voice low, gravelly. "But you don't know what Hollow Creek was back then. The forest wasn't just taking, it was demanding. We had a choice, 4 children or the whole damn town." His hands trembled, but not from age, from memory. I told him choices like that don't just happen. Someone made the list. Someone handed those kids over. His silence was answer enough. When I pressed about Samuel Brooks, Dalton's face twitched with something between guilt and dread. "It wasn't supposed to happen again," he muttered. "The deal was done." His eyes flicked toward the window, like he felt eyes on him, even here. Before I could push further, a brick shattered the glass door behind me, landing with a heavy thud. Painted across it in thick, dripping red letters, "Last Warning." The message wasn't just for me anymore. It was for both of us. Dalton stared at the brick for a long moment, then reached into his drawer, not for the gun, but for a bottle of whiskey. "You keep digging, Schatten," he said, pouring a shaky drink, "and you'll find out what kind of monsters this town makes, and what they'll do to keep breathing." The forest was colder that night, the mist thicker, as if the trees themselves knew I was close to something they wanted buried forever. Guided by an old map from the archives and a hunch that wouldn't let me sleep, I followed a forgotten trail to a clearing I hadn't seen before. The air here felt wrong, heavy with decades of silence and fear. At the center of the clearing stood a crude stone altar, weathered but unmistakably human-made. Around it, the ground was uneven, as if disturbed over and over through the years. A shovel half buried in mud waited nearby, its handle splintered with age. My instincts screamed to leave, but I couldn't. I dug. The soil gave way too easily, like it had been opened many times before. A few feet down, my gloved hand hit something solid. I pulled it free, a small rusted tin box, its hinges nearly fused shut. Inside were fragments of children's belongings. A charm bracelet, a torn baseball cap, a set of tiny plastic figurines. On top of them all, a slip of paper, brittle but legible under my flashlight. Emily Whittaker, chosen first. Jason Lorne, chosen second. Abigail Myers, chosen third. Thomas Reeve, chosen fourth. The list was signed with initials H.D. My blood chilled. Hollow Creek hadn't just lost children. They had selected them, and someone with those initials had overseen it all. As I stood, a branch snapped in the dark. My light caught a figure just beyond the tree line, watching me dig up their sins. They didn't run this time. They only whispered, voice carried on the wind, "You shouldn't have come here." The forest fell silent again, but the truth screamed louder than ever. This was no curse. It was ritual, and whoever started it hadn't stopped. Delton looked like a man already half buried when I slammed the rusted tin box onto his desk. The lid fell open, spilling its grim contents across the wood. The list, the trinkets, the initials H.D. staring back at him like a wound reopened. His face drained of color, his mouth working soundlessly before a rasp slipped free. "You weren't supposed to find this." I pressed harder, demanding answers, asking whose initials marked the page. Dalton finally looked me in the eye, his own lined with something far worse than guilt. "It was never just me," he said, voice raw. "H.D. isn't one man, it's Hollow Creek. The initials have passed hands for generations. Someone has to make the choice, or the woods come for us all." Before I could respond, the office lights flickered and the sound of tires screeched outside. Through the window, trucks pulled up, headlights cutting through the fog. A crowd gathered, men, women, even familiar faces from the diner, all holding flashlights, tools, hunting rifles. This wasn't a mob fueled by anger, it was fear with teeth. Dalton gripped my arm, a desperate whisper escaping his lips. "You've stirred it up, Schatten. Once they believe the pact is threatened, they'll do anything to keep it alive." The front door rattled under heavy fists. Voices hissed through the cracks. "Give him up! End this now!" Dalton looked toward his gun but didn't move for it. For the first time, I saw the truth in his eyes. The sheriff wasn't the predator. He was another prisoner of a bargain made long before either of us arrived. And now, the whole town had come to remind me exactly what price was paid to keep Hollow Creek breathing. The old council hall sat on the edge of Hollow Creek like a mausoleum, its broken windows glowing faintly from lanterns inside. Dalton had slipped me the key before vanishing into the fog, muttering only, "If you want the truth, it's waiting for you there." I entered, knowing I might not walk out. The air inside was thick with mildew and candle smoke. At the center of the room stood a long oak table, surrounded by faces I recognized from the diner, the square, the sheriff's office. Hollow Creek's oldest families, gathered like a jury no one had summoned. And at the head of the table, a woman rose slowly. A face I'd seen in old photographs from 1995. Mayor Helen Dorsey, H.D. She spoke with the calm of someone delivering scripture. 30 years ago, the woods took what they wanted. We made a pact to spare the rest. We chose the names to keep Hollow Creek alive. Her eyes burned like embers as she stepped closer. And now, detective, you've dragged the past back, and the forest is hungry again. A debt must be paid. I laid the rusted tin box on the table, its contents spilling out like an accusation. "Children are not currency," I said. My voice echoed in the chamber, thin against decades of blood-soaked tradition. Some faces around the table faltered, others hardened. Before they could answer, a deep groan reverberated through the walls, a wind rising outside, the forest calling. Lanterns flickered as if something ancient pressed closer, waiting for its sacrifice. The council began to chant low, desperate prayers to a bargain they could no longer control. I backed toward the door, knowing this wasn't over. Hollow Creek wasn't cursed, it was complicit. And as I drove away into the black woods, one thought gnawed at me. Pacts sealed in blood don't end with truth. They end with more blood spilled.